Hello, I'm Jen Benner from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to the webinar entitled Sexual Violence in Later Life. This webinar provides a deep dive into elderly victims and how SARTs can expand their services to identify, increase services to, and provide support to elderly survivors. This is one of many webinars you can find in the SART Toolkit at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit and in the SART webinar series. We would like to thank the Office for Victims of Crime for their support, funding of this webinar and the entire SART Toolkit. We would also like to offer the disclaimer that the opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed are those of the contributors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policy of the U.S. Department of Justice. For more information and resources on victims in later life and information on SARTs, visit the SART Toolkit at www.nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And we would like to let folks know that the content in this webinar may be upsetting, especially for individuals who have experienced sexual violence. So please take care of yourself during this time. And I'm so glad our presenter could join us today. So I would like to now turn it over to Karla for her introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karla Vierthaler, and I'm the Advocacy and Resources Director at the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. We created the SART Toolkit, which we are very proud of. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about sexual violence in later life. And I want to share a little bit first about the aging population. By 2020, our population over the age of 65 will be 17%. So it is a large group of people who vary in age, who are part of our society and our culture. And I also wanted to share the prevalence of elder abuse in general. Now, elder abuse includes self-neglect, includes neglect, which is self-neglect or neglect by a care provider, physical, psychological, emotional abuse. It could include financial exploitation, and it could also include sexual abuse or abuse of sexual contact. And one study found that 1 in 10 elders living in the community experienced abuse in the last year. And then the National Elder Abuse Incidence Survey found that 1 in 10 adults over the age of 70 experienced some form of elder abuse in the past year. So these numbers are very high, and we're going to talk about the prevalence of sexual violence in later life a little bit deeper into the presentation, but I wanted to share a little bit of that background now. So when we say to later life, we really mean some states define it as age 60 and older, some define it as age 65 and older. We're just talking about people in later life. There is no standard definition, just because I have gotten that question a lot. And when we talk about sexual violence, we use that general description of anything that happens to someone or is said to someone without their consent. But this becomes different for survivors in later life, and the abuse can look different. So some examples of that, I generally like to talk about hands-on abuse, sexual violence, and hands-off sexual violence. And we'll start with hands-on. Certainly we know that sexual violence occurs, and it can be a sexual assault, it can be a rape, but there's also other forms that may make elders particularly at risk. So if someone is receiving care and needs intimate care, a person could be violent when they're cleaning them. They can spend more time, they can try to arouse somebody, even when that person is a care provider, so that could be considered sexual abuse. And a hands-on incident. I also have a story that I like to share. There was an aide who worked at a nursing home, and he was going to audition to be a Chippendale dancer. And so what he did is he took the women on the floor that he was supervising and placed them in wheelchairs and wheeled them out to the general area where he performed his audition dance for them and on them. And that is an example of sexual violence because he did not ask them if they consented to all be in that space to watch him dance. And then hands-off abuse, certainly voyeurism, forcing someone to be nude, not getting them dressed, leaving them in the bath too long, certainly sexual threats or unwanted comments. And then the other piece I wanted to share is we have seen, because, so the pornography industry right now is huge, and it's mostly online. It used to be more in video, but now it tends to be more online. And there is certainly a small grouping of pornography that focuses on elder adults. And if you Google older porn, older sex, you will see all of these sites quickly populate. And what we've seen with survivors is that people have filmed them without their consent, forced them to do sexual things, forced them to take sexualized pictures because it is a commodity. All right. So why is talking about sexual violence in later life important to your SART? Well, one, when you're working with an older victim, there are many systems to be aware of that can also impact your work if you're prosecuting a case. There's older adult protective services. There's care facilities. And all of these, there could be in-home health care services for the individual. There could be senior living facilities that may be involved in a person's life. And all of these institutions have different rules and regulations and different systems involved. Could be the Department of Health, could be the Department of Human Services, depending on the state and the laws that are in place. So being aware of these institutions is super important. So you can collect evidence and move forward with the case, making sure that sort of everything, all those involved are present. And also just to work with the elder survivor. We know that not a lot of these cases are prosecuted. The National Institute on Justice found that the older the victim, the less likely the person who offended was to be found guilty. So these cases tend to be harder to work around. And so if you're prepared and know and talk about these issues within your SART, there could be more successful prosecutions and more success working with survivors who are older. So why are adults in later life more at risk? Certainly age-related disabilities, both cognitive and physical, can come into play. Older adults may not be as social due to physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, mobility issues, perhaps they can't drive any longer, so there tends to be more isolation. They could be dependent on care, which could put them at risk. But we also certainly know a lot of elders in our lives, older adults in our lives, who are 70 and perfectly healthy. And I would like to say that, argue that ageism is very real, and a person could be at risk just because they appear to be older, and that's more or less likely to report, easier to overpower, to groom. There are assumptions made about older adults. So how often does sexual violence against older adults happen? That is an in-depth question that I'd love to jump into. You'll see some citations there at the bottom. There's a fair amount. I will tell you that the research on sexual violence in later life is very, very small and minimal. And there's not great studies out there. There is no kind of comprehensive study of people over 60 in the United States that have experienced sexual violence. So we tend to focus more on these smaller studies that dealt with specific communities. So there's some studies, research done on sexual violence in nursing homes, some research done on sexual violence survivors who go to the hospital for the sexual assault forensic exam who are over 60. There's some research done on older adult protective service workers who have interacted with older adults who experience sexual violence. So those are sort of what I'm going to be sharing with you today. One study found that, one state found that 1 in 14 cases of elder sexual violence were reported within their state. So 1 in 14 cases is sexual violence of sexual abuse that was reported. We also know that research shows that sexual abuse is the most underreported form of elder abuse. And another state found that fewer than 5% of the cases of sexual abuse came to light. So we'll dig into some of the other research as we sort of move through some of the aspects of sexual violence in later life. But basically, we don't know how often it happens, but we know it is happening, and we know that elders are not receiving the services they need and not reporting cases. Okay, so where does sexual violence against older adults happen? So that we know that it happens both in the community and in facilities. What we know in the community is that older adults with sexual abuse are violated most often by a family member, predominantly a husband or son. So this could be a new domestic violence situation or one that has been going on for years. The one thing I want to point out, and what we see a lot of in communities, is that, let's say mom or dad needs some care. They still live at home, but they need some care. And they don't want to go to a facility for whatever reason. They want to stay at home, but their needs are becoming a little bit more intense, but they don't necessarily want to bring health care in. And then also part of this scenario is that there's someone in the family, it could be a son, it could be a cousin, it could be a nephew, who isn't doing great. So let's say they have addiction issues, let's say they were incarcerated, something in their lives, they're sort of at a place where they don't necessarily have housing or have transitional housing, and families sort of decide, wouldn't it be great if, while John is getting back on his feet, John or Jane, on their feet, they live with mom or dad. And then they can take care of them, and it can be this wonderful situation. That is a situation we see a lot of where elder abuse is happening and elder sexual abuse is happening. And the other thing I wanted to add about sexual violence in later life is that usually sexual violence in later life is co-occurring with another form of elder abuse. So sexual violence and physical violence is happening, or sexual violence and neglect is happening. And often what happens for survivors is that the neglect comes up and the physical abuse comes up, or let's say financial exploitation comes up, but the sexual violence doesn't, and that is dealt with. So we see a lot of survivors not reporting the abuse because something else is being reported, and they don't necessarily want to talk about that. So who are victims? We know that victims have been found in all age ranges. Of that later life definition, and we know that those who experience sexual violence in later life generally have age-related disabilities, both physical and cognitive. So these are folks that need some sort of care. Women are found to have higher rates of sexual violence in later life, though certainly males have reported and maybe less likely to do so. So that's what we know from research at this point. So how are older adults impacted? And we're going to talk about some physical impacts first. We know that postmenopausal women experience more frequent and more severe genital injuries from sexual assault than younger women. We know that older victims are more likely to be admitted to a hospital after the assault. We know that older women who have been sexually assaulted experience increased rates of arthritis and breast cancer compared to older women without a history of sexual abuse. And we also know that elders who experienced abuse, even modest abuse, had 300% higher risk of death when compared to those who had not been abused. And in that study that I shared a little bit about of women over the age of 60 who had come to the hospital for a forensic rape exam, I think there were about 154 over a multi-year period, and they found that 90% of those women died within a year of the abuse. They didn't know the causes, but I think that is pretty substantial. And then the emotional impact, we certainly know that people who have experienced sexual violence in later life have higher rates of depression. And I'd like to share a story from a focus group that I did several years ago with older adults, none of whom reported being sexually assaulted, but it was just sort of talking through about, did you know where to report? Do you know what services are available? And people were not familiar with rape crisis centers and did not think those services were for them. But it stuck with me when we sort of talked through it, and one woman in this group said, if that happened to me, I wouldn't want to report it. I wouldn't want to talk about it. I would just be ready to go. And what she was saying was that if it happened to her, she knew she was at a place in life where she was going to pass sometime. It's inevitable. And that she would be ready to go sooner if that happened. And that really stuck with me because it's a very difficult thing to deal with. There's many emotions. If you're dealing with systems, there's that. And then to just sort of say, I wouldn't want to deal with it, and I'm at this place in my life where I'm at the end of my life, so I'd rather just not deal with it. Very, very impactful statement. So now we want to share a video of a survivor. So we hear the voice of a survivor in later life. This is Miss Mary. And here we go.
On 911 Thompson.
Listen. Getting a cough out here. I'm hurt.
Ma'am, you need police or rescue.
723 coughs out here.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, in your house.
Okay, you need, what's your address?
Sycamore Street, John's residence.
Okay, listen to me, okay? Take a deep breath, okay? Who are you having a problem with?
Ma'am?
Who are you having a problem with?
I don't know, but please.
Listen to me, ma'am. Who are you?
Please,
Will you listen to me, please? You said it's a maniac in your house. Who's in your house?
Well, he's in the house. He's hurting. I'm bleeding. 723. Please, hurry. Please, hurry.
You know, it was done at night, on a Sunday afternoon, about 6 o'clock. And it went on till 2 o'clock in the morning, on Monday morning, 2 o'clock Monday morning. It went on that long. It didn't just go on just an hour or two and stop. He drove me around that long. And I was black and blue hair. And had a rib cracked back here. He was so drunk. And that's when he said, I'm gonna rub you down. He said, I'm gonna rub you down tonight. And he just went to scrubbing on me, all over me. And I went over that way. I said, don't, Bill, quit. And he got worse and worse. He jerked me up, grabbed me up, went and threw me in on his bed and raped me. So he dragged me out the back porch, down the doorsteps, barefooted, just had my night clothes on, down to the little house, and back a dragging, and I cut my knee across here on something out in the yard. It had grass and gravel all in it. And I got back in the house. He slammed me down, and he taken his fingers and put them by my nose and twisted it around. My face was black and blue. My hands was all cut up. And I'm gonna kill you anyhow. He said, I'm gonna kill you before daylight. Now he told me that, dragging me. I'm gonna kill you before daylight. Nobody won't know who done it.
It's always a difficult video to watch. And as always, thank Miss Mary for sharing her story. She worked with an advocate. She was in Florida, and she worked with an advocate for many years after that, actually. And their program became very strong for working with older victims because that advocate had spent so much time with Miss Mary. So we want to talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms of sexual violence in later life. And this is always hard because I do include a list, but we always like to caution against sort of checklists because there are no actual guaranteed signs of sexual violence in later life. But some physical signs can include vaginal or anal bleeding. But we have heard cases where sexual assault nurse examiners or perhaps just a nurse would not do a forensic exam on an elder adult because said the bleeding could be vaginitis. So that's troubling. So it's not necessarily a sexual violence in later life if there is vaginal bleeding. Always look at anal bleeding as well. Torn, stained, or bloody underclothing. Bruising on the inner thighs. I always find this one very good because certainly we know older adults bruise more easily. There could be more it's not uncommon to see bruising, but bruising on the inner thighs. Our inner thighs are not exposed to things we could bump on very often. So if you see bruising there, it could be definitely a sign. Difficulty in walking or standing, pain or itching in the genital areas, and then certainly unwanted sexually transmitted infections. But I would also caution, how often are we testing older adults for STIs? So that's another sort of way to incorporate that, because certainly older adults can be sexually active as well. Emotional signs. So withdrawal from routine activities, difficulty concentrating, anxiety, confusion, fear. But then I always like to share with this, these are also signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. So sometimes those things could be happening as well in a person's life. But all of these are to say, if you see any sudden change in behavior that is negative, it doesn't hurt to ask, to talk to people about what might be happening in their lives, to determine if something did happen. So creating, this leads great to this slide, creating space to serve older adults within your SART and then within your agencies. So if you are at a SART, if your SART is working on a case of sexual violence with an older victim, here are some thoughts, some things to think about that I've heard over the years from advocates and from other folks who work with older adults. One is creating the time to spend with them. Relationship building is hugely important, and you just have to make the time. The advocate who worked with Miss Mary said that she spent twice as much time with Miss Mary than with other survivors that she had worked with. So that's always something to sort of keep in mind. And then along with that is language. So I don't know if you noticed in the video, Miss Mary says he yanked me around. That's how she described sexual violence happening to her. I've also seen another survivor say he touched me down there. And she used her hands at her waist to sort of show down there. And I always give the example, if you had come up to either of them, if you had come up to the woman who said he touched me down there and said something about penises and vaginas initially, do you think she would feel comfortable in that space? And I think the answer is no. So I think it's important with older adults to spend the time getting to know them and then really try to mirror the language that they use. Another important piece to think about is accessibility. So really thinking through, is your space physically accessible for an older adult? And then also thinking through how you accommodate older adults. So there's some older adults that may have arthritis, and they take their arthritis medicine in the morning, and then they eat a little bit. So if you meet with them at 9 a.m., they might be a little bit uncomfortable and hungry. If you meet with them at 10, they may have eaten and feel more comfortable. So really thinking through sort of medications and how to best how to best accommodate an older adult so that when you're working with them, it's a comfortable time in their day life. And then also, I would certainly encourage folks in your SART to have an elder representative on your SART, potentially work with your area agency on aging or whoever does protective services in your community. Learn a little bit more about care facilities, both in-home care and then facilities that provide care, nursing homes, personal care homes. How are they regulated? What does mandated reporting look like? And potentially bring those folks to your SART so that there's a relationship that can be built. And then reaching out to elders in your community, reaching out to faith organizations, Meals on Wheels, a senior center day program. There's lots of opportunities to sort of reach out and connect with people and learn more about elders and potentially connect with victims in your community. And I think that is it. If there are any questions, certainly I think emails are available all over our website if you have any specific questions. Here are the references, and these will also show up in the PowerPoint that we will have there. Here's more information about us at NSVRC. And thank you.
Thank you, Karla. We hope that you learned a lot from this webinar. And again, you can find more information, resources, and subject matter experts on our website at nsvrc.org/SART Toolkit. And excuse me, again, a big thank you to our presenter, to OVC for making this presentation and the entire SART Toolkit possible, and for you for all the work that you do to support survivors and hold offenders accountable.